Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. Before diving headfirst into any more Star Wars stuff, let's finish what we started with the final game in the Jedi Knight series, Jedi Academy. Going into this game, I was fairly optimistic, though I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. On one hand, it was the same engine as Jedi Outcast, and if it maintained the fun gameplay and saber combat, I was in for a good time. On the other hand, given that I would be playing a self-insert instead of Kyle Katarn, that had me worried the story might not be as interesting or engaging, especially since I had the option to play as a Zabrak or female Twi'lek and was stupid enough to pick a boring human. And yes, feel free to judge me for that. Hell, I've been judging myself for it ever since I made the choice, and I have to live with myself for crying out loud. Regardless, let's get right into it, starting with the story. You are a newcomer to the Jedi Academy named Jaden, an unusual recruit among those who have been selected by the fact that he was able to construct a lightsaber without going through training first. And it's a good thing you have it too, as while you are en route to the Academy on Yavin, your shuttle is shot down and you're left stranded along with your fellow recruits. As it turns out, the ones who shot you down are a new cult of dark Jedi called the Disciples of Ragnos, who for whatever reason have taken interest in places strong with the Force. While you're naturally unable to stop whatever they're up to when you first meet them, you at least make it to the Academy in one piece, and are assigned to train under Kyle alongside another recruit named Rosh. From there, the game sends you on missions to give you first-hand experience of what it's like to be a Jedi, with these missions mostly falling into either information gathering on the Disciples of Ragnos, or working to reassert the Jedi's role as peacekeepers. With this mission structure, you have simultaneously the best and worst change to come between this game and Jedi Outcast. On one hand, in terms of world building, it's an excellent way to explore different parts of the galaxy without the need for a contrived narrative, and creates a great deal of mission variety. For instance, within the first set of missions, one of them is a shootout where you're working with Chewbacca, another requires you to take the initiative to disable a series of explosives, and a third doesn't even involve combat at all. In fact, that last one was a really nice change of pace when I chose to tackle it, as while the intention was to save a crashed merchant ship, it instead became about escaping with your own broken shuttle by gathering the parts required to fix it, all without getting eaten by a giant sandworm. It was a nice chance to remind me how useful force speed was, and served a nice contrast to the action-filled missions that were bundled with it. The issue with this change, however, is that the main story ends up being lacking as a result, and to explain why, we have to start with what Jedi Outcast got right. The main reason why I like that game's story is because Kyle's investment was a lot more personal. We got to see more of how menacing the bad guys were firsthand, and while the start didn't necessarily pertain to the main narrative, it remained laser focused on that narrative once the inciting incident occurred. Jedi Academy, however, has none of this to work with. Instead of playing as Kyle Katarn, a character who has been built up over the course of 2 games and an expansion before Jedi Outcast, we're left with a protagonist who doesn't have much of a personal stake in the fight, and is frankly not all that interesting. You could throw some blame onto me for making him a boring human, but since the story plays out the same way regardless of the character's appearance, it's a hollow gesture that doesn't replace a compelling backstory. I mean, what do we really know of Jaden in actuality? We know that he made his own lightsaber, but we don't know how he did it. We're only told that he did do it in the opening crawl. Imagine instead of being introduced in the shuttle attack that he had been researching the Jedi, finding in the course of that, to his surprise, he has some unfocused control over the Force as well. This could lead him to investigate an abandoned Jedi temple, maybe as something he had explored as a child. But now with a new perspective and the Force, he could discover a secret chamber, one where the Jedi of old mastered the construction of a lightsaber. Shortly after building it, he could have a run-in with the Disciples of Ragnos, who by virtue of his lightsaber would see him as a threat, leading to a negative impression as they inevitably try to capture or kill him. To further cement this, you can have Kyle show up towards the end of the confrontation to chase off their leader, leading Kyle to see the potential within Jaden, but also the potential darkness within him as well. After all, he is still new to interacting with the Force, and he would therefore need help learning how to grapple with it. And who better to help him grapple with it than someone who had done so himself? But instead all we get is that Jaden exists and has a lightsaber somehow, so forget about the protagonist's backstory and go slice up some stormtroopers. And I'll admit that what they have is serviceable enough as an introduction, assuming you abide by the classic FPS standard of plot being little more than window dressing, but after playing Jedi Outcast, it's hard to go back to that time, after knowing that the story could be so much more. What's more is that if this were the only time where the stakes were non-existent, I wouldn't care that much, but then we get to Rosh. Before I continue breaking the game over the coals though, Let me be clear that in isolation, his character arc is really well done. It's properly set up by the events at the start, his actions make sense once we see the end result, and it does end in a satisfying way. What isn't well done is his relationship with Jaden, as while Jaden states that they're friends, you really wouldn't get that impression based on what we see. Every time I think about how the two have interacted, it was either standoffish, tense, argumentative, or competitive in a way that really didn't seem all that friendly. But because we're so busy going off on separate missions, I guess we're just not allowed to actually work together and develop a proper sense of camaraderie before the story runs its course. I mean, if we're able to go off on missions with Kyle, why can't we do one with Rosh to give the two more time to interact, to demonstrate some camaraderie, especially since the main ending hinges on that being a thing? Honestly, I'm starting to think the alternate ending makes more sense given the execution, especially since it's ironically more compelling than the self-congratulatory "OMG, we're all so wonderful" ending we got instead. I mean, the overacting that Jaden engages in during the alternate ending is ridiculous to the point of amusement, but hey, given that the voice acting is overall merely passable anyway, at least it sticks out more. And speaking of sticking out, or in this case failing to do so, don't even get me started on the Disciples of Arachnos, because they just don't have the same impact the previous villains did. Granted, part of this is because Jaden doesn't have the same personal stakes as before, which is a problem I've already addressed, but the previous villains established themselves as a real threat through careful manipulation and decisive action. Actions we got to see firsthand and feel the full force of, no pun intended. In this case, however, they introduced themselves by getting caught off guard, disappearing in a flash, and that's literally it. And then as we're trying to figure stuff out, all we see of them is, "Oh, you haven't seen nothing yet. We're really scary and we're able to do all sorts of stuff to keep you in the dark, but we're also going to be complete lightweights whenever you actually fight one of us directly." Because that's how you know you've got an intimidating villain, when I'm thinking back to how your predecessor's boss fight was harder than yours. So yeah, in case it isn't obvious yet, these issues alone completely killed my investment in the main story. Pretty much everything else was solid, as Kyle is still awesome, the original trilogy characters continue to be themselves, and the Star Wars aesthetic is really well done by virtue of the visuals, audio design, and music. But when it comes to the main story, they simply didn't give me sufficient stakes or compelling characters to latch onto. And while I appreciate the experiment with the different mission structure, especially given how it serves the gameplay, it was an experiment that led to a modest gameplay improvement and a major detriment to the story. But before I completely write the game off, let's give the gameplay its time in the spotlight, especially since the game has made it abundantly clear that we're supposed to be focused on it. If you've played Jedi Outcast, then you'll be right at home here as well, as while it adds a few new things, it's fundamentally more of the same. The main difference, however, is instead of starting you out with ranged weapons, the focus has shifted from gunplay to lightsaber combat. That's not to say that the gunplay is unsatisfying, as it can still be fun to go in guns blazing, but given that saber combat is overall the safer option, that's what you'll mostly be focusing on. In fact, that's ironically my main issue with the combat, as with how safe it is to use lightsabers and given how versatile your force powers are, gunplay is practically an afterthought, save for the times that you're forced to use it to knock out a sniper. So to get that less important gunplay out of the way first, all of the weapons from the previous game make a return, which means much of my criticism of them is the same as before. I really like the fact that all of them have alternate fire modes, meaning there's a lot of variety between the weapons in and of themselves, and that's without going into the variety between the weapons as well, which range from spraying and praying to throwing shrapnel in all directions to high-yield explosives. They've also added a couple of new weapons, including a really dangerous energy cannon that's incredibly deadly if you aren't able to time force push correctly. There are still issues with the crosshair not being entirely accurate, as well as the sniper rifle forcing you to switch to your ranged weapons by instantly knocking a chunk of health off of you, but given that you don't run into them all that often, it's not a big deal this time around. Regardless, the slightly inaccurate crosshair is indicative of a common trend within Jedi Academy's gameplay, that of it being imprecise but still a lot of fun, and nowhere is that more apparent than with the added gameplay conceits. At multiple points, you'll be using vehicles and turrets in order to complete objectives, which include shooting down TIE fighters with a turret and commandeering an AT-ST to punch your way through enemy lines, both of which add some welcome gameplay variety. The most insane of these new additions, however, is the speeder bike, as it's simultaneously amazing and terrible. On one hand, it's incredibly finicky, the controls are unintuitive, and the mission where it appears takes about twice as long as it needs to. On the other hand, it's so ridiculously finicky that it's hilarious to use and to watch it fall apart in glorious fashion. Part of me wants to be mad at it for being so ridiculous, but because of just how busted it is, it's hard not to laugh at it. I mean, if I turn the audio on for this clip, you can tell the game thought I was colliding with the wall, but since the wall was sloped to where I was effectively on top of it, I literally couldn't break out of this no matter what movement commands I gave it. And that's without going into how weird it is trying to use the lightsaber while on a speeder bike, as it seems I end up doing more damage by crashing into enemies than I did swinging wildly with a lightsaber. Oh, and if you want to look at unreliable, just take a look at the AI, because it is absolutely brain dead. To be fair, it can be a little unpredictable in its brain-deaded nature, which does add a bit of tension during saber combat, but if you know what you're doing, it is very easy to cheese the AI into oblivion. Admittedly, part of this is because they put an almanac for all of your force powers and saber moves into the tab key, meaning you can find some really cool moves in there to throw off your opponent. It made it a lot easier to cheese the final boss because I could look up some really useful moves instead of figuring them out on my own. To be fair though, that's an issue with the boss fight's design, not the fact they gave you more information, a fact which I will never raise a fuss over. Regardless, the final boss fight looks intimidating, until you figure out the limitations of the Beam of Death and find a good saber move to spam, the latter of which admittedly took a while, but either way, I think you get the point. One hit saber lock for the win, I guess. At least the cheese I employed for the final boss wasn't inconsistent with the rest of the game, because jumping on their heads to knock them over or just straight up force pushing people off of a cliff are legitimate strategies. Meaning, irrespective of any problems it has, I can't help but laugh at and love the saber combat to death. Oh, but what's even better is that it's one thing for there to be brain-dead AI, it's another for it to be easily exploitable, but then it crosses over into even more hilarious territory when, without any prompting from me, they'll sometimes just straight up throw themselves to their own demise. Honestly, when that happened, I'm surprised my neighbors didn't file a noise complaint, because holy crap, I could not stop laughing. Honestly, if you had asked me if a video game could be so bad it's good, I would have said no before now, because my thought was frustrating gameplay is frustrating gameplay. But this might just convince me otherwise. But, in all seriousness, beyond how amusing the bugs are in this game, I do really respect the saber combat for having a surprising amount of depth, and for being really fast-paced. Given there are a ton of people running around with lightsabers, that means they really did have to focus on properly balancing the game around them, and with how many moves are built into each fighting style, it's hard not to admire it. They not only added more fighting styles with a single blade, but also created fighting styles for double-bladed and dual-wielding, the latter of which my brother and I both appreciated. It might be held together by duct tape and bubblegum, but it is still really fun, and I'm glad that I got to participate in it some more. It also helps that the level design is in really good shape as well, as while it doesn't need to be as complex due to the saber combat, there's still quite a bit of variety. Each area feels distinct not just in the visual department, but also in how you traverse them, keeping just enough of the maze-like level design from the olden days to be interesting, while still leaving plenty of room for fun encounters, with some requiring you to look for platforms among a dilapidated tomb, others requiring key hunting as you navigate an Imperial facility, still others containing some good old-fashioned context clues that take advantage of your force sense. The combat may be what makes the gameplay, but it's the level design that cements it as being interesting to get through, even if the AI performs about as well as your average stormtrooper. Overall, Jedi Academy does its best to distinguish itself from its predecessor by giving us a new protagonist and changing the structure of the missions. But while the solid level design and fun saber combat are maintained and expanded upon, I ended up hating the main story for its lack of compelling characters or interesting plot threads. If the game had come out in isolation, or say after Dark Forces 1, then I might not mind so much. However, while the mission structure means there's more gameplay variety, it's hard to reconcile that approach given how Jedi Outcast managed to tell a good story while still having solid gameplay. So in the end, my recommendation comes down to this. Are you willing to tolerate a story that's weaker than previous entries in order to enjoy what is arguably the best saber combat the franchise has seen to date? For me personally, I'm glad I saw it through, though I still hold Jedi Outcast to be the better game overall. If you're interested, you can find the game on either Steam or GOG. That's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. So now that I've finished going through the Jedi Knight series, I guess I'm gonna have to find another Star Wars game to overanalyze. I've been replaying Knights of the Old Republic lately, but given that pretty much everyone has already talked about the game, I'm not sure I have enough to say on my own to justify a video. There are still a few older Star Wars games I haven't played before though, including one I started a while back actually, though given how long it's been I'll probably need to start that one over. Either way, beyond just Star Wars, there are plenty of games that I want to look at over the next few months, so I'm gonna get back to those, and we'll see you all later.